December 1998. By this time, we had become quite friendly with a Canadian couple. He was from Canada and she was from Honduras. They had 3 children, the eldest girl being the same age as our oldest boy. Our friend was absolutely obsessed with going back to Mexico to live. He had all sorts of weird schemes. He successfully involved us in one in the end. And we were fair game for this because we were not satisfied with our prospects in Brisbane. I was perplexed by the Asian crisis and the lack of students, and I was also not happy with the limited social life available to our children in Kalanga. After a year of both of us working, we'd actually managed to save some money. Maria had been working with the Beerwah cluster of primary schools as a Spanish teacher. This is the place I had actually worked in the high school a couple of years previously. She was in the primary cluster, and she was also a mainstream primary teacher in this cluster. So, in 1998, December, we went to Veracruz for Christmas. We were desperate for a break, and the kids badly needed Spanish lessons and to renew contacts with their cousins. So off we went. But what no one else ever knew, not even the kids, was that we were half expecting, half planning even, not to return to Brisbane from this trip. Of course, we had no money. About $2,000 after the airfares. That was all our savings. When we arrived in Mexico City, we were rather ungraciously received by our old Mexican friend in his huge house. He was a bachelor, of course. He seemed happy to visit us, but not so happy when asked to return the favour. When we arrived, it was almost as though he wasn't expecting us. Marie and I felt uncomfortable about this, and I don't think Marie ever really forgave him. It was difficult to offend Maria, but he managed to do that. It was the beginning of the end of a good friendship, but our friend had become a bit cranky with the passage of time. When we got to Mexico, I immediately became enthused about the idea of applying to Greengates to teach there again. I taught there in 1987, 10 years previously, for a year. So I kept visiting the school to try and butter them up. Actually, they were good to us because they agreed to allow our eldest son, who was 13 at the time, to spend a term in the school without paying any fees. He stayed in a homestay family with a Mexican family close to the school, and we thought it was well worth it. He later told us, as teenagers do, that he hated it. All 13-year-olds, of course, hate change of any sort. But actually, it was very good for his Spanish and, in my opinion, for broadening his horizons. Marie and Serge and Julie remained in Veracruz. I went to a local government school there. Certainly not the most well-resourced school in the world. But I have never heard any complaints from them about this experience. in Veracruz. I was most impressed with the maturity of Maria's nephew, Adrian. I went up to Mexico City in order to stay close to Roger. I used the time to look for jobs, stayed at my friend's house, but I kept visiting Greengates. I then contacted Lancaster School and the Edron, both international schools in Mexico City, albeit of a lower status than Greengates. I got an interview with Lancaster and very nearly clinched a job as deputy head and a teaching job for Maria, but not quite. I also went up to Tequisquiapan to see a new school which was being set up by some British ex-teachers from Greengates. I liked the setup. The town was beautiful, about 3 hours from Mexico City by bus. The school looked as though it might be promising. After my efforts at Lancaster and Greengates had come to nothing, I decided to look again at techies. This time I took Maria with me and the kids. In the meantime, I was disappointed not to be accepted back at Greengates. My friend told me and host told me that they were never really interested. Anyway, Maria and I went to techies in January 1999 with the kids, and after sizing each other up, we were both offered jobs. Maria to begin in April, and for me in August. So Maria was to start almost immediately, but I was to go back to Brisbane in order to sort out the house. The result was I went back to Australia to try and rent the house and pack up. I got home and started to pack and arrange things with the house. In the meantime, Marie went to techies, and almost immediately I started to get emails from her which indicated she was not happy with her situation at the school. Basically, they treated her in the most appalling fashion. She had to share a house with the childless owners who were clueless about the needs of young children. And then she was also asked to teach through Spanish rather than English, as promised, which she didn't like. She had no car and was generally treated like a dog's body by the Brits. It was very unlike Maria to complain about anything, especially people. So when after a couple of weeks she still sounded miserable, we decided to call the whole project off. They were not gracious about her departure either. So back to square one again. Everyone returned to Brisbane. But the kids had had a great 6 months in Mexico, getting to know their relatives. Roger had the Spanish. Job well done. When Marie got back, she was very disappointed to find that her replacement at Beerwah had been appointed to a full-time position at the primary cluster. Moreover, the replacement's language was not Spanish, it was French. Maria had been with the cluster for nearly 3 years. The trip to Mexico had therefore effectively cost her the job. Soon they offered her a temporary contract at the high school where I had been, but she lasted there 4 weeks, 2 more than I had done some years earlier, and she gave up because of the rudeness of the students. Meanwhile, I continued at Embassy College. It used to be called Lorraine Martin, and the contract teachers soon started to lose their jobs. I was put on to the advanced class of teaching, which I enjoyed very much. However, I could see that we were going nowhere financially. I registered for a PhD at Queensland University of Technology, but I got stuck after a few months after my supervisor went on an assignment to Kosovo. So I started looking overseas again and toyed with the idea of going to Saudi Arabia on my own and sending money back to Australia. But at that stage, the idea of splitting the family was something we were determined not to do at all costs. It was to be a last resort. By 1998, the Asian crisis at Embassy College had gone from bad to worse. The assistant director of studies was not popular with anybody because she was self-important, pretentious, and insincere. She didn't like me either. She started to cause problems for me by putting me on classes I didn't like. This all caused me to make my first trip to the doctor to try to get something to help me sleep. I was falling into a depression. The doctor prescribed antidepressants, but pride would not let me use them. Instead, I just drank a little more beer at night to help me sleep. I became less available emotionally to Maria and the family during this period. I was becoming desperate. The situation at Embassy worsened with the arrival of yet another director of studies. She was even worse than the previous one, a heartless individual who would have pushed her grandmother off the bus to save her job. Most of the contract teachers were gone by this time, and although I was the most senior teacher, I knew it was only a matter of time before I would be targeted eventually. It was clear that I would not have a job for much longer, or that the job itself would become intolerable sooner or later. I decided to study for a master's in TESOL so that I could get a better job somewhere. You might think that Embassy College could have been pleased to see me developing myself professionally in this way, but on the contrary, when I asked them to reduce my contract to 4 days a week so that I could study at my own expense, they said no. They said I would have to become casual again. I knew this was the thin end of the wedge. They could then effectively sack me without any of the hassle of sacking a permanent teacher. I decided to do the course anyway and worked casually, sometimes 3 days, sometimes 4 days a week, for several months while I studied for my master's online at USQ Toowoomba.